The system of exploitation, international capitalism, or imperialism is in crisis. As Lenin foresaw, we are living in a time of wars and revolution. Since 1991, the year that the Soviet Union collapsed, the British state and the US state have been permanently at war. They began with bombing Iraq in the name of enforcing a no-fly zone. Now we can see plans that look like they're targeting starting a war on Iran. But at the same time, we see people at last, decent people in Wall Street. And I can assure you, there will be more days of rage and risings in Britain like the ones we saw in August. When 112 cruise missiles were fired at Libya from US and British submarines on the 19th of March this year, we said that this was the 46th separate British military intervention in the Middle East and North Africa since the end of the Second World War. This region has been and is vital for British, French and later US imperialism. It has been essential for the development of a car culture, for the leafy suburbs that surround our cities, for the cheap jet travel, for agrochemical farming, for the lifestyles of the most developed capitalist countries. For cities like this, ablaze with light throughout the night, and it's bars and restaurants full on a Friday evening, yes? Oil. Around here, domination of the Middle East and North Africa has also been critical for determining the balance of power between the major capitalist countries. With almost 2/3 of the world's known oil reserves, this region is bound to grow in importance as China, India, Brazil and others seek to develop. Who controls this region can constrain the emergence of any rivals. By the way, China has $120 billion worth of investment in Iran's energy industry. It is the economic and social crisis of imperialism that provoked the risings in Tunisia and Egypt. There were food riots in 30 countries in 2007 and 8. And food prices are tied through the methods of production directly with oil and oil prices. And it is precisely the rising of the Arab peoples against their domination that now necessitates the scrambling for position by the US, Britain, France and others in the region, and their increased militarism and bellicosity, as we've just witnessed, for example, in Libya. A bit of history, I'll speak quickly because I have to go quickly, so you have time to contribute. The Royal Navy burned down a string of coastal towns along the Arabian Peninsula and sank local fleets in 1819 to 1820. Britain thereby excluded all foreign powers from the region for almost 100 years. By the 1870s, Britain controlled 2/3 of the Arabian Peninsula's coastline, from Aden northeast to Muscat and Oman, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Bahrain and up to Kuwait. Countries whose emirs and sheikhs trained at Sandhurst, even the current ones, military college with the British Army today. As the Ottoman Empire declined, so the rival European powers manoeuvred to take advantage and territory. When oil spurted out for the first time of the Persian ground in 1908, Britain had in place a regional monopoly and a network of political domination over the local feudal ruling classes that ensured efficient exploitation of this valuable and strategically critical resource, oil. That very same year, 1908, Winston Churchill wrote the following: "The establishment of a strong Jewish state astride the bridge between Europe and Africa, flanking the land routes to the east, would be an immense advantage to the British Empire." It was Churchill who, as First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911, had the Royal Navy's engines converted from coal power to oil-powered engines. We in Britain have a particular responsibility for the fate and sufferings of the Palestinian people. It was in Downing Street, no less, that the then Foreign Secretary Balfour issued that fateful and infamous declaration in 1917. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The words used were provided by Chaim Weizmann, who had befriended Churchill in Manchester, where Churchill was an MP and Weizmann was at the university there. In 1948, Weizmann became Israel's first president. Interestingly, and this is worth noting, at the time, the only Jewish member of the British cabinet, E.S. Montagu, no less a figure than the Secretary of State for India, opposed the Balfour Declaration and the creation of a Zionist homeland, saying that it would, in quote, reconstruct the Tower of Babel and that Palestine would become the world's ghetto. That was the only Jewish member of the British cabinet. Balfour's successor, Lord Curzon, opposed the Balfour Declaration and the, quote, intoxicating fumes of Zionism, adding that we have a stronger claim to parts of France. Well, England was thrown out of Calais in 1558. So I don't know what kind of claim he thought we had. Anyway, by 1920, Britain took the League of Nations mandate for Palestine. So why did the British ruling class eventually embrace Zionism? It is revealing to read the government papers of the period. A Zionist entity in Palestine would protect the British position in Egypt and India, and would be, quote, a central pivot of support for our whole Middle East policy, as well as assuring the effective control of our sea and air communications with the East. Thus, the British ruling class, all that time ago, built an alliance with Zionism, driven by geopolitical strategic interests, as it still is today. But for that time, it was the interests of British imperialism against German and French rivals. At the end of the Second World War, the US moved to control what its State Department called a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history, oil, and specifically Saudi oil. US martial aid is always presented as US generosity after the Second World War. About 1/3 of that martial aid provided for post-war European construction and Japanese reconstruction went on oil. Between 1950 and 1965, oil's share in the original 6 European Union countries' energy use grew from 10% to 45% of the total. In 1947, 60% of all British oil came from the Middle East, rising to 70% by 1955. Oil was bought and sold in US dollars. The US had become the endemic imperialist power and used control over Middle Eastern oil supplies to enforce that domination over the other imperialist states. At first, the US government was skeptical about the proposed establishment of the Israeli state in 1948, fearing that the Arab ruling classes would turn both against it, Israel, and then the US itself if it supported Israel. However, the Saudi rulers said that they regarded the conflict in Palestine as a civil, domestic one, and that there would be no abrogation of oil contracts with the US if the US backed the Israeli state. This is worth quoting. This is the US Air Force in 1949 statement. Israel has now been recognized by the United States and the United Kingdom, is likely soon to become a member of the United Nations, and has demonstrated by force of arms its right to be considered the military power next after Turkey in the Near and Middle East. Yes, it was that demonstration by force of arms that Israel impressed imperialism, and that here was, in the words of Theodor Herzl, founder of Zionism, an outpost against Asia, a vanguard of the civilized world against barbarism, one that the US and British imperialists considered worth investing in. Following the 1956 Suez War, the US increased military aid to Israel. After the so-called Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel seized the West Bank, Gaza, Sinai Peninsula and Golan Heights, the US military aid was increased yet again. The Israeli military machine had defeated Egyptian, Syrian, Jordanian forces, and Israel had proved itself as a means of confronting Soviet influence in the region, and thereby as a means of reinforcing US client regimes such as that of Saudi Arabia. Since 1967, Israel has engaged in 7 major conflicts, demonstrating its usefulness to imperialism by force of arms. A war and attrition on the Suez Canal, the 1973 Yom Kippur War, 2 wars on Lebanon, 2 Palestinian intifadas, 2008-9 Operation Cast Lead against Gaza, an almost constant, well, actually constant conflict with the Palestinian and Arab peoples. Over 50,000 Arabs killed, with 5,000 Israelis dead. US military aid to Israel is over $3 billion a year and has been since 1973. In 2007, the US said it would supply Israel with $30 billion worth of military aid over 10 years, with no strings attached, no requirement for progress on any Palestinian deal. Israelis receive $6,000 per family per year in aid. That is how the Israeli state exists. Without that money and armaments, it could not survive. Israel has served as a laboratory for the imperialist military, with the Palestinian and Arab peoples serving as the guinea pigs. The 1967 Six-Day War, combining speed of air cover with rapid tank advances, served as the model for NATO in Central Europe confronting the Red Army. In 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon, it combined US-supplied fighter jets with aircraft radar and unmanned aerial vehicles. Drones used over Beirut in 1982 for the first time ever in warfare. Fitted with TV cameras and thermal imaging systems for the first time in the history of war, they flew over Beirut, sending back images of population and vehicle movements to Israeli analysts sitting at consoles hundreds of kilometers away. Now such machines, drones, fly over Libya, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Iraq, Somalia, and they carry missiles. And the consoles, they're in the US, in Britain, not far from here, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and so on. Drones, an industry of death that is multiplying. When the US and British military occupied Iraq in 2003, the US soldiers were given Israeli Defense Forces rules of engagement, collective punishment, sealing off villages and towns behind razor wire, burning and smashing down homes, torture and assassination squads. These are the rules of engagement of the Israeli Defense Forces. US troops reportedly accompanied Israeli soldiers in the Battle of Jenin refugee camp in West Bank, April 2002. It served as a model for the US taking of Fallujah in 2004. Israel has served as a channel for weapons when the US and British governments have sought to distance themselves or prevent themselves being seen as engaged in the conflicts. Israel armed apartheid South Africa. It armed Pinochet's Chile. It armed the murderous regime in El Salvador in the 1980s, in Guatemala, Honduras, Sri Lanka, and now Africa. It's responsible for tens and hundreds of thousands of deaths by those actions. A defector from the NATO-backed National Transition Council in Libya said that specialists from the Israeli Defense Ministry of Information have been seconded to NATO's headquarters in Italy to advise their NATO allies in the attack on Libya. Psychological warfare operations, presenting the victim as the criminal and the criminal as the victim, which Israel has done and perfected since 1948. Let's look very briefly at who the real criminal and who the real victims are. The first Intifada, between 9th of December 1987 and April 1988, over 130 Palestinians killed, at an average of one per day. The second Intifada, between 28th of September 2000 and 31st of July 2002. 1,700 approximately Palestinians killed, 85% of them civilians, 22.4% of them children, some 380 children killed. The rate of killing, almost 3 Palestinians per day for 10 months. In 2006, 660 Palestinians were killed, nearly 2 per day, including 141 children, or 21.4% of all the fatalities. December 2008, January 2009, Operation Cast Lead, the attack on Gaza, 1,400 Palestinian dead to 13 Israeli soldiers killed, or over 100 Palestinians, mostly civilians, killed for every Israeli soldier fatality. Palestinians administer less than 20% of the West Bank. There are over 200,000 Zionist settlers in East Jerusalem. The United Nations says there are 59 Palestinian refugee camps scattered across the Middle East, where, according to the UN, there are over 4.6 million refugees living outside of Palestine. The response of the Israeli state to any criticism whatsoever is one of calculated scorn. The arrogance of one who is especially protected, and one who, no matter what crimes it commits, can count on more arms, more political and diplomatic support with which to commit even more crimes. There has been no stauncher ally of Zionism and Israel than the British Labour Party. In the United Nations Security Council, the US systematically vetoes criticisms of Israel. Britain, whether under a Conservative or a Labour government, often sides with the US, but sometimes abstains, knowing that the US veto will suffice. This is intended to provide a cloak of neutrality to the British state. But note, whenever a UN Security Council or General Assembly vote does more than just verbally criticise Israel and actually proposes actual sanctions, then the British government does use its veto. Briefly looking at the Labour Party history. The 1917 Balfour Declaration was swiftly endorsed by the British Labour Party and the TUC. In 1931, Chaim Weizmann praised the Labour Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald and acknowledged the role of Labour government in accelerating Jewish migration to Palestine, saying their pro-Zionist enthusiasm went far beyond our intentions. That is, enthusiasm in throwing Arabs off their own lands. The Labour government endorsed the Jewish agency policy of employing Jewish labour only in Palestine, a racist policy. In 1936, the British TUC supported the violent suppression of Palestinian resistance. The 1944 Labour Party conference passed a resolution calling Arabs to move out of Palestine as the Jewish people came in. 1 month and 6 days after Zionists slaughtered 254 men, women and children at Deir Yassin on 9th of April 1948, the Labour government announced it would withdraw from Palestine. In 1956, Egypt's Nasser nationalised the Suez Canal. Labour leader Hugh Gaitskell compared Nasser to Hitler and Mussolini and called for the arming of Israel. The 1973 Yom Kippur War, the British Conservative government embargoed supplies of spare parts for British-supplied Centurion tanks used by Israel. The Labour leader Harold Wilson and his deputy James Callaghan, both at times Labour Prime Ministers, demanded that the Conservative government reverse this policy and resume supplies to Israel. In 1981, Harold Wilson wrote what a colleague of his, Roy Jenkins, called one of the most strongly Zionist tracts ever written by a non-Jew. It was called The Chariot of Israel. We might call it the Chariot of War. We could go on. Neil Kinnock, when leader of the Labour Party. The Israeli Labour Party can rely on the support from me and my party. 1997 to 2010 Labour government. Just one example, 2006, Britain and the US prevented the UN Security Council calling for a ceasefire as the Israeli Air Force and Army attacked Lebanon. Blair, the Middle East envoy, and shuttle diplomacy, the charade of roadmaps and peace plans, while Zionism expands its settlements and the Israeli state and imperialism as its regional allies try to neuter and enfeeble all the Palestinian people. And now we have Ed Miliband as the Labour Party leader, whose relatives are Zionist settlers on the West Bank. The significance of the Palestinian people's struggle will grow as the peoples of the Middle East and North Africa rebel, not only against corrupt and dictatorial states, but as Adam and Jody have pointed out, against the entire edifice of imperialism that has ruled over them for a century and more. The Zionist state of Israel is a key component of that imperialist domination, the most reliable and proven asset of imperialism in the region. and a nuclear-armed asset at that. The Palestinian people's struggle is pivotal and critical for all the Arab people's struggles for sovereignty and democracy. As the Arab peoples move forward, they will necessarily and jubilantly side with the Palestinian cause. We have seen this in Egypt. We will see it wherever the Arab and Middle Eastern peoples rise up. The second Intifada, the Al-Aqsa Intifada, began on 28 September 2000. The victory to the Intifada campaign has been demonstrating outside branches of Marks and Spencer's in solidarity with the Palestinian resistance since then. Marks and Spencer's is the #1 corporate backer of Israel in Britain. We have faced, for these protests, racist, Zionists and police harassment, but we have not given up, and we have been given support by thousands upon thousands of people who support Palestine and know we are right about their people's struggle. This is a small but significant victory for the Palestinian people and for the rights of socialists and workers here in Britain. Like the Palestinian people, and in honour of them, we will carry on until freedom of Palestine. Free, free Palestine! Work with us, join with us in solidarity with the Palestinian people. Come with us on activities, join with us on the protests outside Marks and Spencer's and other supporters of Zionism. Join with us and build a movement actually worthy of the Palestinian people's courage and convictions. And believe it or not, if you fight imperialism and fight Zionism, you will fight global warming as well.